Greetings, saints. Thank you for joining me today. Today we're going to talk about pre, mid, and post-tribulation rapture. Let me ask you, do you want to be taken or do you want to be left behind? That is the question. We're going to look at some scriptures and you are going to be able to come to your own conclusions based on solid and clear scripture. And I think you might be surprised at what you come to at the end of this short teaching. So let's go ahead and begin starting in Matthew 13. We're going to talk about the parable of the wheat and the tares. Let's begin in verse 24. Jesus presented another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went away. But when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. The slaves of the landowner came and said to him, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares?' And he said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' The slaves said to him, 'Do you want us then to go and gather them up?' But he said, 'No, for while you are gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, First gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" This is clearly a picture of the end-time harvest, where Jesus first tells his servants to go gather up the tares, bind them together, and throw them in the fire. And who does that leave behind? It leaves the righteous behind, the wheat in the field, which is then gathered and put into his barn. And Jesus goes to explain this, starting in verse 36, makes it very clear. "Then he left the crowds and went into his house. And the disciples came to him and said, 'Explain to us the parable of the tares of the field.' And he said, 'The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man, and the field is the world, and as for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom, and the tares are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. And the harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. So just as the tares are gathered up and burned with fire, so shall it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks, and those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear." That's about as clear as it could possibly be. This is the end of the age, the second coming of Messiah. The first thing that is gathered are the tares. They're bundled, thrown into the fire, leaving his righteous ones remaining, the wheat, to shine forth as the sun. What an amazing teaching this is, and very, very clear. Let's look at Matthew 13, starting in verse 47. "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet cast into the sea, and gathering fish of every kind. And when it was filled, they drew it up on the beach, and they sat down and gathered the good fish into containers, but the bad they threw away. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come forth and take out of the wicked from among the righteous, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So again, Jesus makes it very, very clear. The wicked are taken out from among the righteous. The bad fish are taken out from among the good fish, leaving the good fish behind. Let's go to Matthew 24, starting in verse 36. It says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away." Who was taken away? The evil ones were. Noah wasn't taken away. He was in the ark, safe and sound, being watched over and protected by his Father. "So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be two men in the field. One will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one will be left." We've seen those scriptures in so many movies. All these Left Behind movies, movie after movie after movie, we see people taken out in the street, taken from pilots of airplanes, taken from whatever they're doing. Their clothes are left behind. And the movies simply always portray that the ones taken are always the good. And yet we're seeing parable after parable, story after story, Jesus teaching us that in fact it's the evil that are taken up first, leaving the good behind. Let's go ahead and press on and see what else we can uncover. We'll read Matthew 24, starting in verse 42. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time, and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour which he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him in the place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So again, another parable very, very clear to us. Who is taken? The evil person. They're taken, cut into pieces, thrown into a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth, leaving behind those slaves that were found carrying out his will, being righteous in all that they were doing. Let's look at Hebrews 12, starting in verse 26. And his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, saying, Yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heaven. This expression, yet once more, denotes the removing of those things which can be shaken as of created things, so that those things which cannot shaken may remain. The principle is crystal clear. When the Lord comes, tribulation, things are shaking, who is left behind? Those that built their house on the rock, those that were doing what they were called to do, those that were faithful in the Lord. It is the evil, the wicked, the people that built their house on the sand that are destroyed in the tribulation when all things are being shaken. Psalm 62:6 and Matthew 7:24 support this. Psalm 62:6 says, He only is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold, I shall not be shaken. When we build our house on the rock, on Jesus Christ, when that shaking comes, we will not be shaken because our foundation is Him. Matthew 7:24 says, Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and slammed against the house. And yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who builds his house on the sand. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew, and slammed against that house. And it fell, and great was its fall. So we can see clearly that end time shaking is the tribulation. And the ones that remain are going to be the ones who built their house on the rock, on Jesus Christ. If we're not founded on Jesus Christ, we will not remain. Let's look at Matthew 24, starting in verse 29. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. So we see clearly the context of this is that the saints are taken up after the tribulation. The saints go through the tribulation. They're not taken up before. They go through it. The context is spelled out in Matthew 24:29. But immediately after the tribulation, 31, he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. So from the four corners of the earth, after the tribulation, Jesus will gather together his elect. That is encouraging. Luke 17, starting in verse 30. It will be just the same on the day that the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, the one who is on the housetop and whose goods are in the house must not go down to take them out. And likewise, the one who is in the field must not turn back. Remember Lot's wife? Whoever seeks to keep his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will preserve it. I tell you, on that night there will be two in one bed. One will be taken, and the other will be left. There will be two women grinding in the same place. One will be taken, and the other will be left. Two men will be in the field. One will be taken, and one will be left. These are the scriptures we heard earlier in our teaching, and it begs the question, where are they taken? And that is the very question the disciples asked Jesus after this. They said, and answering, they said to him, "Where, Lord?" They're not asking, where are the ones who are left behind? We know one is in the field, one is in the bed, one is still grinding. They're asking, where is the one who was taken? Where are those taken people being taken to? And Jesus answers with a shocking response. He says, where the body is, there also the vultures will be gathered. That is verse 37. What Jesus is saying is, if you want to know where the taken ones are, just go ahead and look up in the sky. You'll see a circle of vultures, maybe another one over there, circling around. That is where the bodies will be. Go down below those vultures, piles of bodies, piles of dead people. That's where the ones taken are. The ones left behind are the righteous. Now I ask, do you want to be taken or do you want to be left behind? Yes, there is a time where we will be gathered together to meet him in the air, absolutely. But that is after the tribulation. This is after all this time. We will be gathered from the four winds to meet him in the air. How exciting that day is. 1 Thessalonians 4:17 says, then we who are alive and remain. That context is clear. We're still alive through the tribulation. We remain, we're still here. We're not in those body piles. We weren't taken away. We're alive and we remain. We will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we shall always be with the Lord. That is so exciting and so encouraging. I love it. And one thing I want to share that I think is so important that we understand, in the scriptures, we have a precedence that shows us that going through a tribulation is not a bad thing. The Israelites in Egypt went through a tremendous tribulation with the 10 plagues, and yet we see consistently God watched over and protected his people. Yes, they had to endure some of it, and parts of it they were affected by, but I believe it was after the 4th plague, God said, I'm going to make a distinction between my people and the people of the world, and nothing from that point forward affected them. In fact, I believe they simply prospered during that time, whereas those who were in Egypt, in the world, so to speak, those who didn't follow what God was saying to do, they were devastated by these plagues. And in the very end, that 10th plague, those who did not have the blood of the Lamb on the doorpost of their house, a picture of those who have the blood on the doorpost of their hearts, firstborn died. It says every house was affected. Every house had someone dead from this plague. So when it was all said and done, there were bodies everywhere. And then Jesus gathered together his people. They were on the way to the promised land. What a beautiful, glorious picture for us and an encouraging thing. So in the meantime, we don't need to fret or worry about the coming tribulation. We need to be found busy doing what God has called us to do. We need to be busy about our Father's business, as Jesus would say. May God be glorified. So thank you. Hallelujah.